Ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between, it is Debate Sensei, NFA LD Edition, where we talk about things relevant to competitive debate for the National Forensics Association Lincoln Douglas event. I have with me, as always, Dr. Justin Kirk from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thank you, Dr. Kirk, for being here.
Absolutely. How's it going?
All right. We're doing okay. So we've been covering a lot of tournament results, but I am happy to transition into something a little bit more conceptual and strategic. We're going to be talking about the Disads Counterplan strategy on the negative, but specifically we're going to be applying it to the AI topic this year. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of this.
Yeah, I think, it's good that we're doing this kind of later in the season because we can kind of see how the topic developed throughout the course of the season. And I kind of imagine this discussion kind of taking two phases. The first being like, what do you use a Disads and counterplan for in this topic? Like, what is it useful for? What kind of debates are you trying to get into or out of with counterplans and Disads? And then we can talk about some of the counterplan Disads kind of bundles of strategies.
Yeah.
So I figure we'd start with kind of like why Disads and counterplans are good on this topic and how they can be leveraged.
See the I try to remember back to when I was a novice debater, and I remember always my coach always talking about the importance on the negative, like during prep time. You're in a policy debate because we're in parley, so there's all different types of debate, but why it's so important to have a disadvantage. And normally as a novice, the belief was as long as you had your own standalone disadvantage, that's enough. You know what I mean?
Right.
And you discover, I don't know, I discovered as soon as you start climbing up the ranks, it's part of a strategy. It's not its own strategy necessarily, usually not its own strategy by itself.
Yeah, and I would say especially on this topic, because affirmatives have kind of designed themselves to either be really big, so they have huge impacts. I would say something like Ray Fournier's AGI-AF, Western Kentucky's AGI-AF, or something that kind of navigates to a really small part of the topic, but then argues for a specific framing of the topic, right? Like most of the law enforcement affirmatives. And so I think like in those worlds, some sort of external impact to the affirmative, a disadvantage to the plan action is really useful. And thinking about how you outweigh an affirmative, one Disads sometimes isn't enough, right? So with the artificial general intelligence AF, there's a lot of impacts in that affirmative. And so reading a singular Disads that ends with economic collapse, there's a lot of other impacts that the affirmative can outweigh with. Mm-hmm. Or conversely, if you're going against an affirmative that uses structural violence arguments, a Disads that ends with extinction doesn't win in their framework. So you still have to win kind of a framework debate about the affirmative and whether or not structural violence or extinction impacts come first.
Right.
And so kind of in the way that this topic has been developing with those two directions of affirmatives, singular Disads are usually insufficient. You either need a lot of case debate, and a lot of people have been moving towards that. Good 4 or 5 minutes of case arguments, whittle away at the case impacts, attack the framing arguments and things like that, or read a good counterplan. And so in thinking about, like, for those of the folks who are watching this, if you haven't had experience with counterplans before, counterplan is designed to test whether the affirmative is the best policy option out there. Mm-hmm. And so if you can design a policy that resolves some of the affirmative harms, all of the affirmative harms, most of the affirmative harms, while not interacting or linking to the disadvantage you're reading, you're in a lot better spot, right? And so I think on this topic, when you're thinking about like what affirmatives you would read counterplans against, against structural violence affirmatives, you want a counterplan that's going to soak up a lot of their impact level. Right. A lot of these affirmatives claim to solve for racism, police brutality, anti-blackness, sexism, things like that. And so counterplans that address those impacts and the root cause of those affirmatives are really useful at getting the negative side out of the framing debate, right? Because if you solve the affirmative's impacts in their frame, let's say all else being equal, we both solve an equal level of racism, then an impact like economic collapse probably then becomes a lot more relevant in the debate, right?
Right.
Winning or losing the framing debate as much if you've solved the impacts the affirmative claims to have solved.
So one phenomenon I've come to realize about like debate and like the history of debate is that most of it is still largely oral. You know what I mean? That it's not incredibly well documented in any sort of written form. And what I was told was that like back in the day, debate, like seated debate is like 100 years old. But it used to be expected that it was just case debate, right? You were just doing stock issues, and you were just arguing solvency, and that became insufficient. And so disadvantages were sort of like an evolution of that, and it was supposed to be like just case debate and disadvantages, and then disadvantages start, like not becoming sufficient enough, and then the counterplan is one way to tip the scales. Is that, I don't know, did you get that same sort of oral history of debate that I got?
I mean, that's kind of how I feel about it, right? Like, I mean, I think there's a kind of there's a way of like thinking about debate through kind of argument development, right? And I think case debate has always been a part of debate, right? When debate started, the affirmative would read a case, the negative would argue against it. And there was a time when a lot of people treated the resolution as a hypothesis. Right. And if the affirmative proved it true, it won. And if the negative proved it true, it would lose. So there was really no clash between the affirmative and the negative. They'd each be presenting, different examples of the resolution that are good or bad. Right. And it's kind of up to the judge and the debaters to figure out how to weigh those examples. And I think what happened is people wanted a more predictable, stable way to evaluate debates.
Right.
And so the stock issues were kind of born, which is an idea of, when an affirmative is affirmative, their burden is to prove the resolution true. And what sorts of things should the affirmative have to prove, right? But then it became a little bit hard to be negative because the affirmative would load up on a bunch of defenses against those best arguments. And they would make the argument that, like, look, even if the negative is completely right, there's still a risk the affirmative's a good idea. Right. And so negatives started developing new strategies. Disads were the first one, but then counterplans, critiques, right, to kind of get more advantage against an affirmative that A, has infinite prep, right, and B, has the unpredictability of being able to read whatever they want within the resolutional scope at any point in the season, right? And so in thinking about those advantages, the affirmative, it makes sense that the negative would have to develop strategies to counteract new affirmatives. Disads that link to all actions on the topic. Things like we're going to talk about today, process counterplans, or agent counterplans, right? That kind of attack the mechanisms of the affirmative. So, yeah. Okay.
And so, all right, let's get into a few like sort of more conceptual disadvantage, like the approaches to disadvantages. Maybe not the nitty gritty of them. I call them like types of disadvantages, right? Or
I would say there's like 3 or 4 buckets this year.
Okay.
There's the China bucket of disadvantages.
Okay.
So any affirmative that affects like larger semiconductor trade, AI competitiveness, the race to bigger, better, stronger, faster AI, any military applications. There are typically a group of disads about either trade, conflict with China, relations with China. The US and China have some AI agreements that are kind of like in the works right now. So there's a lot of AI related China stuff. So there's a whole bucket of disads about how the affirmatives, restrictions, prohibitions would hurt our ability to compete with China, to defend against China, to trade with, have good relations with China, etc. And I think those disads are primarily against bigger affirmatives that impact extinction level or war impacts or some sort of econ impacts, right? I'm talking about things like the nukes AF, the laws AF, the AGI AF, our financial technology AF, right? Like those kind of affirmatives that do big AI prohibitions at the national level that impact economic or foreign policy. Those tend to link to most of the China disads.
Right. And so like when you talk about like the how it affects semiconductors, like
Mhm.
I start honing in on the word substantially, that there's a, the actual substance that makes up AI, the actual material um, components that make AI possible, that like you have to affect that somehow. I guess that's a little bit more of like a disad topicality strategy rather than the disad
Yeah.
plan that.
Well, and I think that affirmatives like the AGI app that Western Kentucky's reading kind of get at that question, right? Because they restrict the compute power,
Right.
not necessarily the model or the application, right? So like
Mhm.
FRT is an application of AI. It takes
Mhm.
AI models and uses them as a technique of law enforcement, right?
Okay.
Or large language models or Gen AI
Yeah.
as a kind of AI that can be regulated. Whereas Western Kentucky's AGI app regulates the amount of computing power, which would directly impact how semiconductor chains of supply work, relations
Right.
with Taiwan, etc. And so I think that, like, yeah, that's absolutely part of the topic that is, and I think they've made that argument on the substantially violation before.
So let's say that you're doing, you talked about which ones do link. Now,
Yeah.
which ones would you have to, what cases would you have to look out for that, you'd have to work harder at establishing a link to that disad, or maybe you just don't run it, like,
Yeah, I think that like most of the cases that affect domestic law enforcement don't affect the China kind of set of
got it.
disads,
Right.
and those link to a whole other set of disads, right? I think anything that probably seeds ground to someone other than China, maybe
Okay.
like something that like probably impacts our relations with Russia. Like, so I think that like the laws AF, the Lethal Autonomous Weapons AF,
Right.
probably has more links to the Russia-Ukraine conflict than necessarily the China-Taiwan conflict.
Okay. Okay.
But against those domestic AFs, I think that like there's a whole set of disads you can read against any affirmative that isn't what we would call a big stick AF. So facial recognition, deep fakes, law enforcement, and those kind of fit into two categories. The first is the economy category.
Mm.
Depending on the technology you impact, the amount of restrictions you place, how broad those restrictions are, you're going to impact some part of the economy.
Okay.
Artificial intelligence is a growing industry. Some are arguing it's a bubble. Some are arguing it's not a bubble, and that's actually like an infrastructure development phase of something much
Oh, okay.
broader, right? Like a lot of people who write about AI say that you need to think of AI more like electricity, in
Mm.
that it's not something that's going to have a particular application, but it makes all applications work better as a kind
Oh,
of like layover, right?
right.
And so in thinking about like how does it affect the economy, if you put a prohibition on something like facial recognition technology, well, facial recognition technology isn't just used in law enforcement. It's also used by Apple to
Right.
unlock your phone. It's used at the airport to check your ID. Yeah, that's kind of law enforcement, but it's more air traffic control,
Right.
right? So like you might affect broad swaths of the economy in ways you don't anticipate.
Hmm.
And then the other set of disads are disads, I think, relating to kind of federal restrictions on technology. So this would be things like the federalism disad,
Okay.
the politics disad, any sort of courts, or there's a disad that folks are reading about the Loper-Bright decision that the Supreme Court made last year.
Hey,
That
what's that?
the Loper-Bright decision basically eliminated the Chevron doctrine,
Oh,
which
eliminated it.
deferred definitions of keywords to agencies. So
Okay.
let's say the FCC is regulating artificial intelligence.
Uh-huh.
Pre-Loper, the FCC gets to define what they're regulating.
Mm.
Post-Loper, yes, they still get to define that, but if the judges think that there's a better definition, the courts can rule or Congress can direct the agency to restrict in a certain way.
Okay.
And so there's a whole set of kind of like legal arguments about the way the affirmative is impacted or impacts the Loper decision.
Okay.
There's federalism, which is that the plans of federal action and that states have a lot of kind of these restrictions in place now. California in particular has a
Right.
lot of restrictions on artificial intelligence. New York is another state that has a lot of restrictions. And so federal restrictions might upset the balance between state and federal
Wow. Okay.
AI prohibitions.
Okay. Now you said there was many buckets. Were those
Those are kind of two of the four buckets. The China
Okay.
disads are another bucket.
Yeah.
And then I think the fourth bucket is just kind of a series of disads that are very specific to the affirmatives.
Okay.
So things like the police union's disad,
Got it.
which only applies to law enforcement affirmatives, right?
Right.
The First Amendment disad, which only applies to privacy affirmatives, right?
Okay.
There's certain sets of disads that link to certain areas of the topic that aren't just generic or overbroad, or certain disads that like link to a specific affirmative.
Right.
Like I'm thinking about, like, there was a Ukraine disad that linked to the lethal autonomous weapons systems AF for a while. And I think it's probably not unique after the Oval Office meeting on Friday.
Oh God.
You know, what do you do?
Yeah.
But
Wow.
overall, I think that there's a fourth bucket of like case-specific disads that like very specifically target a particular prohibition.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that covers the four buckets. China disads. You can throw kind of Ukraine, Russia in there, but it's more of a specific laws disad.
Right.
Kind of politics and courts disads for domestic AFs. Econ disads. And then case-specific disads or area-specific disads. Disads that only link to a small subset of the affirmatives.
Okay. So if we're going to so those four buckets, at least those four buckets, probably more, but it seems like once you know your counterplan, you can actually start anticipating. Oh no, once you know your disadvantage, I got ahead of myself. Once you know your disadvantage, you can actually start anticipating your counterplan.
Yeah, or vice versa, right? Like I think that like sometimes, I think either way, one piece has to fit with the other. And I think if you're watching this and you're thinking about like, how do I do counterplan disad debate? Think of them as a unit, right? Like the counterplan should be avoiding the impacts that you don't want to have to deal with on the affirmative. So let me give you an example. We read a big finance AF, right? And if you wanted to solve the impact of that AF, you need to solve for the economic collapse that the AF is preventing, right? So you read a counterplan that solves the economic collapse. But you don't want to read a disadvantage that ends in economic collapse because the counterplan is supposedly solving for that. You want an impact that ends in something else, maybe like federalism and or a kind of like a dollar hegemony scenario, which is a kind of econ scenario, but it's more about influence and soft power and trading relations. And so when you're thinking about reading a counterplan disad together, you always want to find a disad that doesn't necessarily interact with the affirmative's impacts. You can find disads like that, but with the counterplan, you're already trying to resolve those impacts. So you want a disad that does something else, that impacts some other area, has some other terminal harm to it.
Right. So like when people try to do a case turn, as you call it, right? It's like, oh, we solve for economic collapse. It's like, no, you actually cause economic collapse. If that argument is true, that by itself should win, right? It's like doing a counterplan actually doesn't add anything to it. Like maybe you're hedging your bets, but it doesn't necessarily. They're not necessarily working together. They're like independent, and you could sever out of one or the other, and it wouldn't really affect either one. That way.
Yeah, and then those debates become more about like which causes economic collapse faster. Right? It's a time frame debate. It's a link propensity debate. It's a uniqueness debate. And those debates are great. Like I love to watch a good link debate, right? But it becomes a different debate at that point. And the counterplan becomes largely irrelevant because when you're reading a counterplan and disad against an affirmative, your goal is to reduce the affirmative risk outside of the counterplan to as little or nothing as possible. You want the counterplan to solve 99 to 100% of the affirmative, and that's the best case scenario for you, because if you do that, the risk of the disad becomes a problem for the affirmative, and it usually ends up in a negative bet.
It's a kind of a strange strategy to avoid a case turn, because that's like offense, you know what I mean? If your counterplan's better, you know what I mean? If it's got a better story to it, then and the case turn doesn't have that great of a story to it, you're not going for that offense because you're reserving that for the offense that the counterplan provides.
And well, let me give you a good example of this, right? So one of the kind of main counterplans this year has been the regulations counterplan.
Okay.
The resolution requires that people prohibit
Right.
a technology. So let's use facial recognition as an example. The affirmative prohibits facial recognition technology. Well, there's a lot of evidence that facial recognition technology is getting better. That if certain data sets are used, if certain restrictions are placed on it, then using it isn't as harmful as the affirmative implies.
Right.
So maybe we should regulate the technology and place strict regulations on it. And maybe it's used very little, but when it is used, it's used well. Right.
Right.
And then you wouldn't want to read FRT like is good necessarily, because a lot of your arguments are saying, no, it's still bad, but we can restrict those bad things away. Right. Nor do you want to read, other things that kind of implicate the affirmative. You could read some stuff that's like prohibitions fail, right? Okay. You can't make AI illegal. Somebody's always going to have AI. We read a lot of circumvention arguments against affirmatives when we debate them, about like other companies, other countries, rogue actors developing those things anyway. And so the regulations counterplan would be like, well, if you give people a pathway to develop it, then development happens in the light as opposed to on the black market or underground, etc. And so you can start to see how all those arguments fit together, and you need a disad that links to the prohibition, not the regulation. Or not the end effect of the affirmative. And so that's where things like the politics disad come in place, the Loper disad, federalism, things like that. Right.
And so that's what also fights against any permutations. And so I had a hard time. I think a lot of people have a hard time developing counterplans that cannot be permed. Even though you could prohibit and regulate, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but technically you could.
Technically.
That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. It would be really confusing to people that are trying to abide by the law.
Right? Well, and even the prohibitions that you would impose would be like, if you do the following things, you're prohibited. But that technically is defined as a regulation by the courts. Right. A series of conditions under which use is allowed and disallowed, i.e. prohibited, is more of a regulation because it regulates the whole field of activity. Rather than prohibiting something. So that's one bucket of kind of counterplans is attacking the prohibition stuff. Right. And that's if you want to talk about like the technology is getting better or it's good. Right. The other set of counterplans that I think are useful to know about are agent counterplans, especially on this topic. So you can have federal agent counterplans. Let's say the courts decide that a certain type of technology is illegal. That would be different than Congress prohibiting it. You could generate offense off of Congress not acting and the courts acting. Either it increases the court's credibility, fights in Congress cause the politics disad, so changing the federal agent has some opportunities, as well as the executive order counterplan. Having Trump just issue an executive order that is the prohibition versus Congress doing it. And then the other set of kind of agent counterplans are the ones that capture the federalism disad, which would be state level counterplans. So things like the 50 states counterplan. There's a National Governors Association counterplan floating around to have the governors get together and enact kind of like executive orders at state level. There's an uncooperative federalism counterplan, which is like the governors refuse to do any more federal mandates until the federal government does the AF. They basically it's like a conditions counterplan.
I see.
The states will do federal mandates on the condition that AI like this is prohibited. That's a counterplan that Western Kentucky broke against us in round 5 of the round robin. So there's a whole series of like counterplans based on how to make federalism better or keep it stabilized, right? And then there's a series of counterplans that deal with the foreign / external impacts to AI. They're trying to consult counterplans, consult NATO,
consulting,
make a deal with Ukraine, I think there was a QPQ or like a negotiate with China counterplan floating around earlier.
Yeah, it seems like whenever you have some sort of external actor disadvantage, the consultation is just the go-to counterplan. Right? I'm having a tough time thinking of other counterplans that work well with it, because you can't really. I don't know. I've heard some people trying to just fiat China. You know what I mean? Like let's just, instead of being the federal government, let's be China. I'm like, theoretically, that seems weird to me. If the AF isn't doing that, then just kind of like sidestepping that. I'm like, I don't understand the sort of underlying theory or why I would vote for it.
Well, and there's a lot of good arguments as to why consultations is just how we do things to begin with. They don't announce a policy until there's negotiations on it, right?
Right.
As kind of a piece of advice for folks who are watching, right? If you're going to read counterplans, there's a few things you should know, right? Which is, what's the status of your counterplan?
Okay.
Is it unconditional? Are you going to go for the counterplan?
Right.
Right? Is it conditional? Are you going to kick the counterplan, or are you just going to go for a disad, or you go for some other strategy? And then there's a third category, which is called dispositional, which is that like the affirmative kind of gets to pick and choose when they stick the negative at the counterplan. The general idea is, if the affirmative reads some offense, like a turn to the counterplan's action or theory, the negative has to go for the counterplan. Whereas if the affirmative is just like, we permed it, we tried to prove it's not competitive, then the negative can kick the counterplan. People don't really use dispo much anymore. So I would say, like, kind of think about what status of counterplan you're reading. If you're going to read a conditional counterplan, be ready to debate theory. A lot of people don't read counterplans or don't go for counterplans because they don't really debate theory that much. And don't know kind of what judges' feelings about theory are. And I think the general rule is like, one, start thinking about why these counterplans are legitimate or illegitimate. What kind of debate do they promote, right? Like, what kind of debate does consult counterplanning promote? What kind of debate does agent counterplanning promote? And what kind of debate is that good or bad forms of debate? And can we talk about like the strengths and weaknesses of it? Start writing your own theory blocks and thinking about why your counterplans are good for debate and good to challenge big or small affirmatives, right? A lot of times these counterplans are designed because the affirmative is abusive. Not because the counterplan's a bad idea, but because the affirmative does something that, like, either I don't have a chance to weigh my impacts against, or does something that's so outlandishly big, there's no way for me to win the debate without some sort of like clawing back some of those impacts. And so I think in thinking about like, well, why did you read a quote unquote abusive counterplan? Well, maybe the affirmative was abusive. Maybe it was non-topical, right? And so when you're developing the theories for why your counterplans are good, think about all those things in a holistic sense and the strategic sense of why you needed to read the counterplan in the first place.
Right. In general, it seems like the deployment of counterplans is a way of just taking the debate off of the ground that the affirmative is trying to outline as where the clash should be, and now putting it in an area that the negative is just more comfortable having. You know what I mean? Like that seems to be the fundamental strategy. It's not really necessarily. It's like, oh, I'm just crushing you. It's like, okay, I'm gonna replace the center of this debate into something that I have a little bit more ammunition on.
Yeah, if I'm negative, I would much rather have a debate about my disad and my counterplan than about the affirmative, right? And so if I can force the debate onto the ground of, I solved most of the affirmative, so now you have to go for solvency deficits to my counterplan, which means now you're talking about my counterplan.
Right.
Or competition arguments about my counterplan. Now you're talking about my counterplan.
Right.
And like link outs to my disad, you're not spending time extending solvency for the affirmative, talking about why the affirmative is a good idea. Right. And now I've already won a framing and persuasion question of like, which are we talking about more, the affirmative or the negative set of arguments? Right. And next week when we talk again, I mean, I think this is the primary strategy of critique debaters. Right. The primary strategy of critique debaters is to move the debate onto the ground that the negative chooses, not the ground that the affirmative chooses, right? And so I think when you're thinking as the affirmative about how to debate these things, how do you get the debate back on your terms? How do you talk about the AF more? How do you make the AF return to the center of the debate? Sometimes that can be really hard. Sometimes that can cause you to spend way too much time in your 1AR doing case debate, thinking you just need to put the aff back in the debate. So sometimes a lot of debaters overcorrect for that,
Right.
and don't spend nearly enough time on the off case position. So I think either side, it's a very careful balance. But I think both sides want to talk about their arguments at the end of the debate. And you're right. Counterplans, disads. We're going to talk about the process of the affirmative, not the harms.
Right.
That's not what the app wants to talk about. The app wants to talk about racism and sexism and you know, anti-blackness, not about if Congress is authorized to do this.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I mean, it reminds me of, you know, court cases where you get into like procedural arguments. You know, it's like, hey, we're not talking about the guilt or innocence of this person. We're talking about, you know, whether or not the Miranda rights were read beforehand.
The admission of evidence.
Like that. Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And again, that then becomes a performative moment for the negative. Well, if the app can't even tell you how the mechanism of the affirmative solves, right? What's to say that their solvency deficits are true either, right? I mean, this is if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit kind of moment, you know, in the real sense. Like you said, it's just like a court case. But now we're talking about the glove instead of the crime, right? And as a negative, you do kind of think like a defense attorney, which is any way possible to stop talking about the affirmative. The problem, right? we're gonna figure that out.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to extend this discussion, but we're going to talk about how disadvantages work with critiques in our next episode, which is also a fascinating.
Disads, critiques, and case debate. I would say that NFA LD, primarily when critiques are read, they're usually read by themselves or with a T argument. Sometimes people read them with disads, but we'll kind of continue like how critiques can function like that. You know, and why their disadvantage is more to the resolution sometimes than affirmative. So I look forward to that discussion as well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we will be back in the future and talk about that. Thank you very much, Dr. Kirk, for all of your insights.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me again, Jared.
All right. See ya.
Yep.